The Galactic Council didn't realize who they insulted. The chamber smelled like something between burning copper and old rain. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked in. The second thing I noticed was that there was no chair for me. My name is Calvin Reeves. I was the first human being to stand inside the Grand Conclave of the Galactic Council, and I was doing it on my feet behind a railing in a section that the Council called the Observer's Gallery. It was a polite name for what it actually was, which was a pen, a holding area, a place where species that did not matter stood and watched the species that did. The chamber itself was extraordinary, I will give them that. It rose in a wide spiral, level after level of curved seating carved from a stone so dark it looked like frozen night. 412 civilizations had representatives seated at the main table below. 412 species that had earned the right to sit, to speak, to vote. The light inside the chamber came from bioluminescent panels running along the walls, and it shifted color slowly, cycling through hues that I later learned corresponded to the emotional spectrum of the Velhari, the oldest species in the room, the ones who had built this place 12,000 years ago. I stood at the railing and looked down at all of it, and I kept my face calm, because that is what you do when you are the first representative of your entire species, and every set of eyes in the room, human and otherwise, is watching to see how you react. There were 9 of us in the observers' gallery that day. 4 humans, including me and my aide, a young woman named Claire Dalton who had graduated top of her class at the Diplomatic Institute and was now standing very still and breathing very carefully. Beside us were 2 representatives from the Murath, a species of small, 6-limbed beings with silver fur who had been in the observer's gallery for 60 years and showed no signs of graduating from it. And then 3 tall, thin beings from a species I did not recognize who had not introduced themselves and did not look like they intended to. Below us, the session had already started. I had been briefed on council protocol. Before arrival, sessions began at a specific harmonic tone which none of the human delegates could actually hear, but which apparently signaled the start of formal proceedings. The first hour was typically administrative, routine motions, scheduling confirmations, acknowledgments of new observers. That last part was supposed to include us. It did not. An hour passed, then another. Council moved through 17 separate agenda items without once acknowledging that humanity had entered the room. I watched the Velhari delegation below, seated closest to the central dais. Their lead delegate was a creature named Shoveth, ancient even by Velhari standards, with a body like layered gray stone and eyes that moved independently of each other. Shoveth had been on the council for longer than the human species had. Possessed written language. I had read the files. I knew what Shoveth had seen: the rise and fall of empires, the extinction of 6 civilization, the slow march of galactic history. I had a certain kind of respect for that. Shoveth had none for me. The acknowledgement came in the 3rd hour, casually, buried between a motion about shipping lane taxes and a report on a territorial border dispute in a system 300 light-years away. The session caller, a thin avian species, whose feathers were deep green, read from its panel in a flat tone: observer registration for cycle 1847. New observer group, species designation. Human home system Sol, provisional. Status, observation rights only no. Voice no vote no standing, gallery. Position 4. That was it, that was humanities. Introduction to the Galactic Council, 14. Words and a gallery position number. Claire Dalton wrote something in her notebook and said nothing. I said nothing. And then Shoveth spoke. The Velhari elder turned those two independent eyes up toward the observer's gallery, and its voice came through the translation feed in my earpiece like gravel being poured slowly down a metal pipe. I see the mayfly species has arrived, dressed in borrowed starlight as expected. Laughter moved through the chamber, not loud, not cruel in the way humans might be cruel but present. A ripple of amusement from 412 civilizations who found the comparison accurate and worth acknowledging the mayfly species, a creature that lived for a single day. Something that came and went too fast to matter. I had read the translation notes on Velhari speech patterns before arrival. When Shoveth said borrowed starlight, it meant technology obtained rather than developed, the implication being that humanity had not truly earned its place among the stars, that we had found a shortcut, that we were tourists in a galaxy we did not understand. The laughter faded, the session moved on. Nobody looked at the gallery again. I turned to Claire, who was still writing in her notebook. She glanced up at me, and I could see in her expression that she was waiting to see how I would handle it, whether I would respond, whether I would demand recognition, whether I would do anything at all. I smiled just slightly, the way you smile when someone has made a mistake they do not yet know they have made. Write that down too, I said quietly. She looked at me. The date, the exact words, who laughed. Write it all down. She did. We stood there for another 2 hours, watching a council that did not know us, mocking something it had not bothered to understand, governing a galaxy it assumed would remain exactly as it was. I spent those 2 hours memorizing faces, learning the body language of species I had only read about, watching who deferred to whom, who interrupted whom, who sat close together and who sat at opposite ends of the table. I was building a map in my head, not of stars but of relationships, of leverage, of the quiet architecture of power that no briefing document had fully captured. When the session ended and the lights shifted back to neutral white, I was the last one to leave the gallery. I stood at the railing for an extra moment, looking at the empty chamber below, at the 412 chairs arranged in a perfect arc, and the space at the outer edge of the table where no chair had been placed for us. I was not angry. Anger would have been wasteful. I was paying attention, and in my experience that is a much more dangerous thing. The last species that underestimated humanity had done it from high above, looking down at a planet where we were still learning to make fire. We had come a long way since then. We had a habit of coming a long way, faster than anyone thought possible, in directions nobody expected. Chauvin had called us mayflies. A mayfly lives for one day, yes, but it does not spend that day standing still. Back in the human quarters aboard Conclave Station, Claire set her notebook on the small table between us and looked at it like it might start doing something on its own. The room was narrow and functional, the kind of space designed by people who had Not expected their guests to need much. One porthole looked out into the dark. Through it I could see the slow rotation of the station's outer ring and beyond it nothing but stars. Dr. Owen Marsh was already seated when we arrived. Owen was our xenohistorian, a compact, quiet man in his mid-50s, with a habit of folding his hands when he was thinking hard and unfolding them. When he had reached a conclusion, he had been studying the Galactic Council for 23 years without ever expecting to be aboard one of its stations. He looked like a man who had been handed something he had spent his whole life dreaming about and was now slightly suspicious of it. "You've seen the session transcript?" I asked. "I have," Owen said. And Chauvet is 12,000 years old and has been wrong before." He paused, though. "Rarely in public." Claire put the notebook on the table and sat down. "They didn't even look at us for 3 hours. They looked," Owen said. "They just didn't consider what they were looking at." I poured water for myself and stood at the porthole. The station's rotation was slow enough that the stars outside appeared to drift, moving gently from one edge of the window to the other in long, lazy arcs. I had been on 6 space stations before this one. They all had the same particular quality of silence, the kind that comes not from the absence of sound, but from the presence of too much empty space just outside the walls. "Tell me what the archives say about us," I said. Owen unfolded his hands. That meant he had conclusions. "Humanity's file in the Council database," he said, "is 14 pages long." I turned from the porthole. 14 pages, he repeated in case I had not fully absorbed it. "The Velhari file is approximately 900,000 pages. The Sewell Collective's file is 240,000 pages. The smallest file belonging to a full council member is the Roth, a species of semi-aquatic beings who have been spacefaring for only 800 years, and their file is still 4,000 pages long." "And us," Claire said, 14 pages. 14. The first 6 are observational reports from Velhari long-range probes that detected our radio signals. The next 4 are assessments of our technological development, dated at intervals of roughly 20 years each. The last 4 are the formal application for observer status, the Council's response, and 2 administrative memos about which gallery position to assign us. The room was quiet for a moment. "What do the assessments say?" I asked. Owen opened his tablet and read without editorializing. Assessment 1, roughly 80 years ago. Species demonstrates early stay. Technological development likely. Candidate for natural plateau within 2 to 3 generations. Assessment 2, 60 years ago. Species has achieved early faster than light travel. Assessment revised. Plateau expected within 1 generation as resource and social pressures stabilize. Development. Assessment 3, 40 years ago. Plateau has not occurred. Development continues at anomalous rate, flagged for continued observation. Assessment 4, 20 years ago. No plateau detected. Development curve remains outside standard parameters. Origin of acceleration unclear. Possible external assistance suspected. External assistance, Claire repeated. "They thought someone gave us the technology," I said. "They thought someone gave us the technology," Owen confirmed. "Because the alternative, that a species only 200 years into space flight could developed that consistently without help, did not fit their models. This was the thing that the council had not understood, the thing that I'd been trying to find the right words for since long before I ever set foot on this station. Every other spacefaring civilization the council had ever encountered followed a pattern. They emerged, they expanded rapidly, and then they leveled out. The expansion slowed, the innovation curve flattened. They reached a kind of equilibrium, a stable state of development where they were comfortable and capable and not meaningfully changing. It was so consistent across so many species that the council had built their entire classification system around it. They had timelines for how long it took a species to reach that equilibrium, and they used those timelines to predict where any new civilization would be in 100 years, in 1,000 years. Humans had never reached equilibrium. Not once, not for a single sustained generation. Every time something pushed back against us, we pushed back harder. Every time a wall appeared in front of us, we went over it or around it or through it, and then we kept moving. We did not stabilize, we did not plateau, we accelerated and we kept accelerating, and the council's models had no category for that because they had never seen it before. They think it was luck, Owen said, setting down his tablet, or that we had help. Those are the two working theories in the xeno-historical community out here. Nobody has seriously proposed the third option. Which is, Claire asked, that this is simply what we are. I sat down. Outside the porthole, a star I did not know the name of drifted slowly to the left and disappeared behind the edge of the frame. I thought about the history I had grown up with, not the clean version that people told at ceremonies, but the real one, the one full of catastrophe and recovery, of things going wrong in ways that should have ended everything and somehow not ending everything. The plagues that swept through populations and left behind people who had learned to build medicine. The famine that starved civilizations into dust and left behind people who had learned to reshape the earth to grow food. The conflicts that tore apart everything we had built and left behind people who had learned eventually, slowly, painfully, to build better things the next time. Every disaster had produced an adaptation. Every adaptation had made a stranger more capable, harder to predict. We did not learn from success. We learned from catastrophe. And we had experienced enough catastrophe that by the time we looked up at the sky and decided to go there, we were carrying inside us 10,000 years of hard-won lessons about surviving things that should have finished us. The council had never seen a species like that, because no species quite like that had ever walked through their door before. A formal memo arrived while you were reviewing the session transcript, Claire said. She slid a document across the table without comment. I picked it up. It was from the Council's Classification Division, stamped with the session date and delivered to all observer status groups. It was a routine document, apparently, one sent to all new observers upon arrival, placing them formally within the Council Species Classification System. Humanity had been designated Grade 3 Emerging Species. Grade 3 was the category for civilizations that had not yet left their home star system. We had 17 colony worlds. We had been operating outside our home system for 60 years. We were Grade 3. I set the document down carefully. I did not bend it or crumple it. I was very deliberate about that. We're going to file an objection, I said. Of course, Claire said, already writing. Formal, documented, submitted through the correct channels with every piece of supporting evidence we can attach to it. And when they ignore it, Owen asked, not cruelly, just practically, then we'll have a record that they ignored it. I looked at the document, sitting flat on the table between us. Everything they dismiss, every correction they refuse, every door they close gets documented, all of it. Owen looked at me for a moment, then he nodded once, the slow, deliberate nod of a man who has spent his career studying civilizations and has just understood something he had not fully understood before. You're not trying to change their minds right now, he said. No, I said. You're building something. I'm doing what humans do, blank spaces. I said, I'm filling them in. The objection was filed the next morning. It was thorough, professionally written, and accompanied by 60 pages of documentation, mission logs, colony census data, trade records, and a brief xenohistorical summary that Owen wrote in one night without sleeping. It was formally received by the Council's administrative office. It was assigned a case number. It was placed in a queue. And there it sat. 3 weeks later, we received a one-line response. The classification had been reviewed and confirmed. Grade 3 emerging species. No further correspondence on the matter would be entertained at this time. I filed the response in the same folder as the original document, and I went back to learning everything I could about the people who had sent it. Because here is what the Council did not know about us, the thing that Chauvet had missed entirely when it looked up at the observer's gallery and saw Mayflower dressed in borrowed light. We do not give up. Not because we are reckless. Not because we are incapable of recognizing when the odds are against us. We are very good at recognizing when the odds are against us. We have had a great deal of practice. We do not give up because at some point, across thousands of years of doing exactly this, getting knocked down and getting back up and finding a new angle, we stopped treating setbacks as signals to stop. We started treating them as information about where the weak points were, information about what the other side believed they could get away with, information about the exact shape of the obstacle, so that when we finally came back at it, we would know precisely where to push. I was not angry at the Council. I was learning its shape, and I had filed everything they had done wrong in a folder that was going to get very heavy before any of this was finished. 3 years is a long time when you are paying close attention. I had spent them well. My team had grown from 4 people to 11. We had developed working relationships with 6 other species in the observer's gallery, including the Mureth, who turned out to be extraordinarily well-connected despite their lack of formal standing, and a species called the Davin, amphibious beings with remarkable memories who had been sitting in that gallery for 40 years and remembered every procedural slight ever delivered to them with crystal clarity. The Council, meanwhile, had not changed at all. That was the thing about ancient institutions. They moved like glaciers, slowly with great weight, grinding everything beneath them into a fine and consistent powder. The Velhari had been building this system for 12,000 years. They saw no Reason to question it now. Then the Kivhari and the Sul started fighting. I was in the middle of a working lunch with Claire and two of our Murath contacts when the alert came through. A territorial conflict had broken out in the Arathan cluster, a dense star system, region about 300 light-years from human space, rich in trace minerals that both the Kivhari Dominion and the Sul collective claimed as sovereign territory. The Kivhari were aggressive and hierarchical, a species that had built their entire civilization on the concept of legitimate expansion. The Sul were calculating and patient, a species that had expanded through careful infiltration and strategic withdrawal for 2,000 years. When those two philosophies met over the same star cluster, the result was predictable. What was not predictable was how fast it spread. Within 6 weeks, the conflict had expanded well beyond the Arathan cluster. Both sides were maneuvering fleets, establishing blockades, testing each other's boundaries in a series of probing engagements that each side denied were actual hostilities. The Council convened emergency sessions. Committees were formed, subcommittees were formed to advise the committees. Representatives gave speeches. Speeches were formally entered into the record. The Kivhari and the Sul kept moving their fleets. On a Tuesday that I will not forget, Claire came into my office holding a document with the particular careful way she held things when she was angry, but being professional about it. They've designated the Varath corridor as a conflict buffer zone, she said. The Varath corridor was a navigational lane that ran through a section of space that the Council had, for bureaucratic reasons, never formally assigned to any single species. It was technically unclaimed. It was also the primary transit route between our 3 outermost colony worlds and the rest of human space. Cutting that corridor would effectively strand roughly 400,000 human colonists. And they want us to evacuate, I asked. They've given us a formal request to withdraw all human presence from the corridor and the 3 colony worlds within its operational range within 90 days. Claire set the document on my desk. The Velhari delegation submitted the request on behalf of the full council. Shove it. Signed it personally. I read the document. It was courteous in the way that only very old institutions know how to be, which is to say, it was dressed in the language of concern while delivering something that was not concerned with us at all. The Council expressed its deep appreciation for humanity's understanding. It noted that the colony worlds in question were, of course, observer status settlements and therefore did not carry the same protections as full member settlements. It assured us that relocation assistance would be considered on a case-by-case basis. Observer status settlement, that was the phrase that caught me. We had built those colonies, we had sent people there, built hospitals there, buried our dead there. They had schools and water systems and 30 years of history, and to the Council they were observer status settlements, which meant they were inconveniences rather than homes. When is the formal Council session on this? I asked. 4 days. I'll be there. 4 days later, I stood before the full chamber of the Galactic Council for the first time, not from the observers' gallery but from the floor. I had submitted a formal request to address the Council under the provisions of Council Protocol 7, which technically allowed observer status, species to speak on matters directly affecting their populations. The provision had not been invoked in over 200 years. The administrative team had apparently needed time to locate the relevant paperwork. The chamber was full, every seat occupied, the bioluminescent panels on. The walls were cycling through a slow gold to violet shift that someone later told me indicated heightened attention, which was either a compliment or a warning, possibly both. Chavez sat at the center of the main table as always, those two independent eyes finding me immediately. I had prepared a speech. It was careful, measured, built on procedural arguments and legal precedents and requests for formal review. And GT snorts. And GT. I had 3 versions of it ordered from most diplomatic to least. I had intended to use the most diplomatic version. Then Chavez spoke before I could begin. The Mayflower returns, it said through the translation feed, with 90 days remaining to comply. I am curious what there is to discuss. The laughter was smaller this time. Few delegations, not all of them. I put my prepared speech on the table in front of me, face down, and did not look at it again. Ambassador Chavez, I said, keeping my voice level and clear, the Galactic Council has formally requested that humanity abandon 3 settled colony worlds, including the homes of 400,000 people, in order to serve as a buffer zone for a conflict between 2 council members. I am here to inform the council, respectfully and formally, that we will not be doing that. The chamber was very quiet. The council is advised, I continued, to account for the current disposition of human assets in the region before proceeding further. Chavez's 2 eyes moved slightly, an expression I had learned to read as mild curiosity. What assets does a grade 3 species possess that would be relevant to this discussion? I suggest, I said, that the council check its long-range scanners before the end of the session. I gathered my papers and returned to the gallery. I could feel the weight of 412 civilizations watching me go. 12 hours earlier, I had made one call to Earth Defense Coordination Office. Brief call, 6 minutes long. I had not given orders. I had described a situation and asked for an assessment of available options. The response had arrived within the hour. At the time I was speaking before the council, the long-range scanning system serving Conclave Station were detecting something in the Verath corridor that had not been there 72 hours before. 17 ships, human vessels, none of them registered with the council because we had not been required to register them, none of them classified in the council's database because the council had never bothered to ask what our shipyards were building. They were sleek and dark and arranged in a precise formation between the corridor's entrance and our 3 colony worlds, and they were broadcasting on open frequencies in a calm, clear, non-threatening voice that the corridor was occupied and that civilian transports were advised to plan alternate routes while the situation was being assessed. The Kavari fleet, which had been advancing toward the corridor from the north, stopped. The Sul fleet, which had been moving toward it from the east, stopped. Neither of them had encountered human military hardware before. Neither of them knew what it could do, and in the calculus of conflict, an unknown factor of 17 vessels positioned perfectly and holding absolutely still was a very heavy variable. I was back in my office when Claire's communications panel lit up with an incoming high-priority transmission from the council chamber. "They want to talk," she said. "Tell them I'm available tomorrow morning," I said, "at 9:00. She looked at me. "Not tonight." "Tomorrow morning," I said. "Let them look at those ships on their scanners. Tonight, let them think about what they do not know about us." She entered the response. Outside the porthole, the stars drifted, their slow, familiar drift, and somewhere out in the dark, 17 ships held perfectly still between what was ours and everyone else, making no threats, requiring no justification, simply being there with the quiet, absolute certainty of a species that had learned long ago that the most powerful statement you can make is not a raised voice but an unmistakable presence. We had not fired a single shot. We did not need to, because sometimes the most effective thing you can do is simply arrive and wait and let the other side begin to count things they had never thought to count before. The meeting the next morning was not in the main chamber. It was in a smaller room, one I had never been invited into before, a private council briefing space on level 7 of the station's administrative wing. The walls were the same carved dark stone as the main chamber, but the ceiling was lower and the lighting was steady, white, and factual, not the shifting bioluminescent wash of the big hall. There was a round table with enough seats for 12. I brought Claire and Owen. The council sent 5 representatives, including at the center Shoveth. The Velhari elder looked different in a small room, still ancient, still composed, but the scale of the chamber was no longer amplifying it. Here, across 6 ft of table, Shoveth was simply an old being in a chair, and I was simply a person in another chair. And we were going to talk. "You have caused considerable disruption," Shoveth said as an opening. "The conflict between the Kevhari and the Sul caused disruption," I replied. "We responded to it by placing warships in an active buffer zone without council authorization, by placing our own vessels in an unclaimed navigational corridor within range of our own settlements in response to a request that those settlements be abandoned. The corridor is not designated council territory. The corridor has never been designated anything, which is why it was selected as a buffer zone in the first place. If it belongs to no one, then it belongs as much to us as to anyone. One of the other council representatives, a being from the Arathi delegation whose name I had memorized as Councillor Dreth, leaned forward. "The vessels you deployed carry weapon systems that are not on record with the Council Defense Registry. We have not been asked to register weapon systems with the Council Defense Registry," I said. "Observer status species are not required to do so. They are also not permitted to operate unregistered military assets in disputed space. The corridor is not disputed space. Corridor is unclaimed space, and we are not operating military assets. We are operating vessels with defensive capabilities in proximity to our own populated worlds while a conflict between 2 council members moves toward those worlds." Dreth sat back. Owen, beside me, had his hands folded on the table and was looking at the middle distance with an expression of calm academic interest that I knew meant he was very carefully not smiling. Shoveth spoke again. The elder's voice through the translation feed was slower than usual. Each word placed with deliberate care. What are you exactly? The room went quiet. It was not a procedural question. It was not a tactical probe or a diplomatic formality. It was a genuine question asked by a creature that had watched civilizations rise and fade for 12,000 years and had just encountered something that did not fit any of its categories. I let the silence sit for a moment, not to be dramatic because the question deserved a genuine answer, not a prepared one. And genuine answers sometimes need a breath of space before they arrive. I will try to explain, I said. I started with Earth. Earth is not a gentle planet. It never was. In the long history of life on its surface, the dominant pattern was competition, constant, layered, relentless competition for food and territory and survival. The species that lived there did not exist in comfortable equilibrium. They pushed against each other and against the environment without pause. And one species, over a few 100,000 years, developed something that no other planet in the Council's records had produced in quite the same way, not intelligence by itself, not tool use by itself, but the combination of intelligence and adaptability and something else, something harder to name. The Council's xenobiologists have a category, Owen said quietly, speaking for the first time, called apex predator species, species that evolved at the top of their food chain, unchallenged, which then developed intelligence. The pattern is consistent. They tend toward confidence, toward expansion, but they reach equilibrium quickly because they never needed to develop the kind of sustained problem-solving that comes from prolonged challenge. Humans, I said, evolved under pressure, continuous pressure. We were not unchallenged. We were prey as well. As predator, we were cold and sick and starving and threatened from every direction, and we survived anyway. And every time we survived something, we added it to a body of knowledge that the next generation inherited. Every species learns from experience. Dreth said. Every species learns, I agreed, but not every species is built the way we are built. We are not optimized for comfort, we are optimized for recovery. There is a difference. I leaned forward slightly. When the Council looks at human history, you see chaos. I understand that 200 years of space flight after 10,000 years of recorded civilization, much of it marked by catastrophe and conflict, to a species that has been spacefaring for 12,000 years and has achieved stability that looks unstable, unreliable, dangerous, possibly. It does, Shoveth said. What you are not seeing, I said, is what we built every single time we came back from one of those catastrophes. What you are not measuring is the speed of the recovery. What your models do not account for is that every failure in human history produced a lesson, and we kept those lessons. We carry them individually, culturally, institutionally. We do not discard them. We are made of them. I paused. You called us mayflies, I said. Creature that lives one day and is gone. I understand why that comparison seemed accurate. We are young by your standards, extraordinarily young, but mayflies do not remember anything. They do not build on what came before. They simply exist for their single day and are finished. Humanity is not finished. Shoveth was very still. We have been mapping this region of the galaxy for 40 years, I continued, not because we were directed to, not as part of any official program, because we had people who were curious and the tools to satisfy that curiosity and a deep and unshakable instinct to fill in blank spaces on maps. We mapped every council member's home system, we mapped transit routes and resource distributions and population centers and the locations of council infrastructure. We did this as a matter of habit, not strategy. I let that land. That is not a threat, I said clearly. It is a description of what we are. We are explorers, we are builders, we are a species that looks at empty space and sees potential rather than emptiness. And we are a species that has been told, since we arrived here, that we do not belong at the table. You do not have the standing, Dreth said, but the certainty in the statement had thinned somewhat. By your current rules, no, but rules are things that people made, and people can change what people made when they have sufficient reason. Shoveth's eyes moved, both of them simultaneously, which I had not seen before. The translation feed carried no words. The expression, if it was an expression, was unreadable. You are asking for reclassification, one of the other representatives said. I'm asking for accuracy, I said. Humanity is not a grade 3 species. We have 17 colony worlds, active trade, relationships with 4 spacefaring civilizations, a of deep space, exploration vessels operating across a range of 800 light-years, and a defense capacity that I believe the past 18 hours have demonstrated is not trivial. Categorizing us as grade 3 is not a procedural decision, it is a fiction, and maintaining that fiction serves no one. It maintains order, Dreth said. It maintains a particular arrangement, I replied. Whether that arrangement is order is a question worth discussing. The meeting ran for 4 hours. No decisions were made, no commitments were given, but something shifted in that room slowly and without announcement. The way tides shift, not with drama but with the quiet persistence of water finding its level. When we filed out into the corridor, afterward Owen walked beside me. Silence for a moment, then he said. Shoveth's eyes moved together. I noticed, I said. In Velhari expression, that indicates something between reassessment and alarm, Owen said. I have never seen a recorded instance of a Velhari council member doing that in a session. Good, I said. That is not necessarily a comfortable reaction to provoke. No, I said, but it is an honest one. And right now, I would rather have their honest reaction than their comfortable dismissal. We walked back toward the human quarters. In the long, steady light of the station's corridors, and behind us, the 17 ships in the Varath corridor continued their patient vigil. And the council continued to stare at its scanners, and the Kavhari and the Sul had not moved in 30 hours, and the galaxy had become, in some quiet fundamental way, a slightly different place than it had been the day before. It took 6 weeks for the political situation to fully crystallize. The Kalhari and the Sul eventually agreed to a council-mediated ceasefire, and the Varath corridor was formally withdrawn from the buffer zone designation. Our colony worlds were never touched. Our ships returned to their regular patrol routes without any public announcement of their departure, which I felt was the appropriate way to end that particular statement. But the session in the small room on Level 7 had started something that ceasefire between two other species could not stop. Word travels fast in a place where 412 civilizations share a single station. Within 3 days of our meeting with Shoveth, I had received 11 private communications from representatives of other council species, not from the senior members, the old powers, the Vilhari and the Arathi and the Sul, but from the others, the mid-tier delegations, the ones who had been full members for less than 2,000 years and still remembered what it felt like to be newer than the people around them. And then, much more quietly, the communications began arriving from the observers' gallery. The Murath sent their representative, being named Kess, who arrived at my door one evening carrying a flat data tablet and an expression of careful neutrality. You said things in that room that have been said privately for a long time. Kess told me the difference is that when you said them, the other side listened. They listened because of the ships, I said. They listened because of the ships. Kess agreed, but they heard because of the words. The Murath set the tablet on my table. It contained a list of 63 names, all of them observer status, species, all of them sitting in gallery positions, watching a table they were never invited to join. These species would like to know if you have a plan. I looked at the list for a long moment. I have an outline, I said. I need to make it into something more solid. How long? Give me 2 weeks. Over those 2 weeks, in the narrow corridor between my role as a diplomat and my role as something I did not yet have a name for, I built the structure of what I later came to call the Reform Coalition. It was not a rebellion. I want to be very clear about that, because the Council's initial characterization of it as a destabilizing movement was inaccurate and deliberately misleading. It was a legal, procedural, formally documented proposal to amend the Council's membership and governance charter. Everything was done through correct channels. Every draft was shared openly. Every argument was built on Council precedent. I worked with a lawyer named Philip Crane, who had come with the human delegation as a trade specialist and turned out to be one of the most precise legal minds I had ever encountered. Philip could find the exact sentence in 12,000 years of council jurisprudence that made our position defensible, and then he could write the argument for it in language so clean and unambiguous that fighting it meant arguing against your own rules. Alan contributed the historical analysis. Cass and the Myriad contributed connections to 40 of the 63 gallery species. A Davin historian named Vel, who had 40 years of accumulated institutional memory and the patience of someone who had long since stopped expecting justice but had not stopped working toward it, contributed a comprehensive record of every procedural violation and classification inconsistency that the Council had committed over the past 2 centuries. It was, by the time we submitted it, document of remarkable thoroughness, 312 pages of formal argument, historical evidence, statistical analysis, and legal precedent, concluding with a single clear request: full voting membership for all spacefaring species regardless of years of spaceflight, a revised classification system based on actual capability rather than arbitrary thresholds, and the dissolution of the Observer's Gallery as a governance Structure. The council received it on a Thursday. By Friday evening, Shovath had convened an emergency session of the senior membership to discuss it. By Saturday morning, the political battle had begun in earnest. I will not pretend it was clean or easy. It was neither. The council's old guard pushed back with every tool available to them: procedural delays, classification challenges, requests for additional study periods, referrals to subcommittees that had no authority to act. Shovath was particularly formidable. 12,000 years of institutional experience does not make someone wrong, but it makes them very good at defending a position, and the Velhari elder defended the existing order with the calm precision of someone who genuinely believed it was correct. There were days when I thought we might not get there, when the delays piled up, and the subcommittee reports came back negative, and the senior members closed ranks in ways that felt impenetrable. On one of those days, Philip came to find me in my office late in the evening. He sat down across from me and did not say anything for a moment. "Do you know what the average length of a major council reform effort is?" he asked eventually. "Tell me." 340 years, he said, "from first proposal to ratification." "We don't have 340 years." "No," he said, "but we have something the previous reformers didn't have." "What's that?" He smiled just slightly. "The ships in the corridor are still on the scanners, not our ships now. Every species that joined the coalition has contributed observers, 11 vessels total. Nobody threatened anyone, nobody said anything, they just showed up. I had not known that, I had not asked for it." "The Myriad sent one," Philip continued. "The Davin sent two, 8 other species sent one each, none of them coordinated with us directly, they just arrived in the Verath corridor over the past week and took up positions." I sat with that for a moment. "They're not there for the corridor anymore," I said. "No," Philip said, "the corridor dispute is resolved. They are there because this is how you signal solidarity without saying anything that can be entered into a formal record. It's the language of presence. Apparently it's a very old language in this part of the galaxy. The Velhari invented it." I found that last part genuinely funny. In a quiet way. The vote came on a morning when the station's light panels were set to a warm amber, which someone told me was a council tradition for major sessions, color associated with significant decisions in Velhari culture. I sat in the gallery one final time, not because I had been required to, but because it felt right to begin in the same place I had started. The chamber was entirely full, every seat. The gallery was packed with observer species, more than it had ever held in recent memory. Beings pressed together along the railings, watching the table below. The proposal was read into the record by the session caller. All 312 pages summarized to its essential motion in 47 words that Philip had written with the care of someone engraving a monument. Then the vote was called. The senior members voted first. The Velhari bloc voted against, as expected. The Arathi split 3 against and 2 in favor, which was not expected and caused a brief ripple of surprise through the chamber. The Sul, calculating as always, voted in favor after privately determining that a restructured council served their long-term interests better than the existing one. More votes came in from across the table, and they came in on both sides. And for a time, I genuinely could not tell which way it was going. I kept my face still. Claire beside me was counting quietly, under her breath. Then the coalition member votes began. The full members who had joined the reform effort, 12 civilizations that had over the previous months moved from cautious observers of our effort to active participants in it. They voted in favor one by one, and each vote was entered into the record. And when the final tally was announced, the motion had passed by 4 votes. The chamber was very, very quiet. The session caller said the words that had not been said in the recorded history of the council, the formal declaration that the membership structure would be amended, that the classification system would be revised, that the observers' gallery would be formally dissolved within the next council cycle and its occupants reclassified under the new framework. I did not cheer. Nobody on our side cheered. It did not feel like that kind of moment. It felt like something that had been a long time coming had finally arrived, and the right response was not noise, but a very deep breath. We filed out of the gallery in silence, and in the corridor outside the chamber, Cass found me and touched my arm. Briefly, the Murath equivalent of a handshake, and said 60 years, quietly, meaning 60 years the Murath had sat in that gallery, and did not finish the sentence because there was no need to finish it. The next morning I was called to the council chamber again. Not to the gallery, not to the small meeting room on level 7, but to the main floor, to a chair that had been placed at the main table in what had previously been empty space, a human chair at the council table. I walked across the main floor of the Grand Conclave chamber in full session. For the first time, my footsteps very quiet against the dark stone, and I sat down. The chair was functional and unadorned. No ceremony about it, just a chair at a table, which is what a chair at a table usually is. I ran my hand along the edge of the table surface. It was smooth and very slightly warm, the stone retaining some quality of all the light that had washed over it for 12,000 years. I thought about everyone on Earth who had never lived to see this. I thought about the people who had pointed telescopes at an empty sky and dared to dream that something was out there. The ones who had run the early calculations and built the early ships and gone out into the dark without knowing what they would find. The ones who had been told in one way or another by one voice or another that they were not ready, that they were too young, that they were too chaotic, that they should wait, that they should be patient, that their moment would come when the universe decided they were worthy of it. And then I thought about what we had done instead. We had not waited to be invited. We had not waited to be told we were ready. We had shown up and we had paid attention, and we had built something out of nothing, out of 14 pages in a database and a gallery position number and a dismissal dressed up as a courtesy, and here at the end of it we were sitting at the table, not because the galaxy had decided we deserved it, because we had decided we deserved it. And then we had done the work to make the argument impossible to deny. Choveth entered the chamber and took the seat at the center of the table, as always. The elder settled slowly, those two ancient eyes scanning the room with a practiced sweep of a being that had seen this chamber through 12,000 years of Chain. When the sweep reached me, it paused. For a long moment, Choveth looked at me. Across the length of the table. I looked. Back, not defiantly, not with triumph. Just clearly, the way you look at someone when you have something real between you, even if that something is the memory of a long argument finally concluded. Then Choveth did something that I did not expect. The Velhari elder rose from the seat, slowly, with the great deliberate care of an ancient body performing an act of intention. And then Choveth inclined that enormous gray head forward and down, held it for 3 seconds, and raised it again. In Velhari culture, I had learned a bow from a seated position to a standing one means respect given upward to someone above you. A bow performed while rising, given at the same level, means something different. It means acknowledgement between equals. It means I see you now, as I did not see you before. It is not an apology exactly, but it is the closest thing the Velhari have to one. I inclined my head in return, not deeply, not in deference, at the same angle for the same 3 seconds. We sat back down, the session called to order. 413 civilizations around the table, plus 11 new additions waiting for their formal seating to be arranged over the coming weeks. The work of the council continued, as it always had, slowly and with great weight, but now with different weight behind it, weight that was distributed across more hands and more perspectives and more kinds of experience than had ever sat at that table before. Someone had told me once, years before all of this began, that history is not made by people who wait for the right moment. It is made by people who decide that the moment they are in is the only moment there is, and then act accordingly. I had acted, we had acted, 63 species, sitting in a gallery with nothing but patience and a growing file of documented slights, had found something to rally behind, and had rallied and had pulled something into existence that 12,000 years of institutional habit had insisted could not happen. As the session began around me, I opened my own notebook, the one I had been keeping since that very first day in the gallery, since Choveth had called us mayflies and the chamber had laughed. And I turned to the first page. The entry was simple, a date, a name, a quote, and a note in my own handwriting at the bottom that said, "Write this down." I wrote one more line beneath everything. They didn't realize who they insulted. Honestly, I'm glad they didn't, because the version of us that had to earn this, the version that was told no and documented it, that was dismissed and kept showing up, that placed ships in a corridor without firing a single shot, and built a coalition out of 63 species who had been waiting for someone to try. That is the version of us that deserved to sit here, not because we were the strongest, not because we were the oldest, because we never, not once for a single day, considered the alternative. I closed the notebook. The session continued, and for the first time I was part of it.